Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, Nigeria wins an appeal in a London court and no longer has to pay a Virgin Island-registered company damages that would have come to around $11 billion. This after Abuja backed out of a deal it says was only won through corruption. Also, as the Springboks prepare for the ultimate rugby showdown this week in the Rugby World Cup, in the Rugby World Cup final, I speak to the head of the sport across the continent about what he sees as being its potential off the pitch in terms of bringing benefit to African communities who may not be directly involved in the rugby game. And the French helicopter carrier Mistral is on a 4-month mission in the Gulf of Guinea to combat piracy and trafficking. It's also taking part in joint naval exercises with partners like Nigeria, even as the French presence in the region fuels tensions elsewhere. We take a closer look. But first of all, Nigeria no longer has to pay a multi-billion-dollar fine over a failed gas deal. Now, a London court has backed Abuja's appeal over damages that would have seen it handing over around $11 billion to P&ID. Now, that company is run by two Irishmen, and it sued Nigeria after a 2010 agreement for it to operate a natural gas plant in Nigeria. And that fell through after Nigeria countered, saying that the deal was only ever won through fraud. Our Sam Olokoya tells us more.
Nigerians are relieved that the little-known British company, Process and Industrial Developments, failed in its legal attempt to claim $11 billion in compensation from Nigeria for breach of contract. The company, also known as P&ID, lost the case as a London judge ruled that it got the contract fraudulently after paying bribes to a Nigerian oil ministry official. The contract involved the construction of a natural gas processing plant, which the company did not even build. Nigerian officials say it was a non-existing contract, as relevant government departments were not aware of it. The case highlights how Nigerian government officials connive with foreign companies to sign fraudulent contracts. These contracts often leave Nigeria vulnerable to litigations. In some instances, the country ends up paying substantial compensations to companies for contracts which they did not execute. President Bola Tinubu described the judgment as an end to the economic conspiracies between private companies and corrupt officials who conspire to extort money from the country. If P&ID had won this case, it would have stripped Nigeria of a third of its foreign reserves. The consequence would have been grave for a country facing serious economic crisis.
Sam Olokoya there for us. Now, Nigeria's Supreme Court has started hearing the last legal appeal against the outcome of February's presidential election. Bola Tinubu of the APC party won 37% of ballots, beating the PDP's Atiku Abubakar and outsider, the Labour Party's Peter Obi, in one of the most tightly contested votes in Nigeria's history. Now, opposition candidates who lost out in that vote claim that various irregularities from the Electoral Commission did not meet the constitutional requirements. An election appeals court has already rejected their petitions. The 7-member Supreme Court are now expected to rule over the next few weeks. Rwanda said that it sent 16 tons of humanitarian assistance to Palestinians under siege in Gaza. Kigali's donation was made through the Jordan Hashemite charity organizations and was of food, medicine and medical supplies. Israel has ramped up strikes on Gaza in response to the October 7th attack by Hamas extremists, which led to the murder of 1,400 Israelis. More than 5,000 Palestinians have since been killed in retaliatory attacks on Gaza. And UN peacekeepers in Mali have left their camp in the Aguelhok northern region of Kidal. The MINUSMA peacekeeping mission has been moving up its departure from the country following orders to leave from the ruling junta. That was delivered in June. Now, over the weekend, MINUSMA pulled out of the Teslit camp in the region. There had been fears that MINUSMA's exit could lead to an intensification in fighting between Malian soldiers and armed extremist groups that have ramped up attacks across the country. Now, it's been a fascinating and exciting Rugby World Cup here in France. And with South Africa's Springboks having firmly secured their place in the final to face off against New Zealand's All Blacks, the might of African rugby has once again been on display for the world to see. Now, Namibia also made a brief but worthy appearance in the tournament, but it really is the Springboks who carry the hopes of a continent for this weekend's final. But the head of Rugby Africa is also hoping that all the attention can give the African game a longer term boost. He's joined me today on set. Thank you so much, Mr. Mensah, for coming in to speak to us on Iron Africa. Now, first of all, is what's good for the Springboks really good for African rugby more widely?
I think so, very much so. Africa are the world champions. People forget that South Africa is part of Africa. You can turn the table and talk and say, what about another sport where Cameroon or Morocco or what? That's part of Africa. I think that when it is that the Springboks do as well as they do, it permeates right the way through the system. We need it to happen. Children are inspired by it. You may have heard Sia Kolisi, the captain of the Springboks, the other day, actually embraced the fact that they were playing not for South Africa, but for the whole of Africa. And I think that's very significant.
When you're saying playing for the whole of Africa, give us a sense of what the wider African rugby scene looks like, because I think the Springboks do tend to be the first ones that spring into mind when you think about African rugby. But, you know, what is the state of African rugby in general, and does it get the support, the respect that it deserves?
I think Africa rugby is in a good place. Does it get enough support? No, it doesn't. I think quite clearly, and it's public knowledge, that we receive about $2.5 million a year, something of that order, for 39 different countries. So clearly that's not enough to run competitions and to promote the game and to invest. But we are now trying to look for new forms of funding. We are putting pressure on our global body, World Rugby, to invest more in the game so that some of the First Nations countries who are involved in rugby are receiving over 100 million a year, not all from World Rugby. So if somebody's getting 100 million a year and 39 countries are getting 2 million or 3 million a year, you're not going to be able to expect them to compete at exactly the same level. South African government have invested much, much smaller than you are getting from the major countries outside. But comparison to the rest of Africa, obviously a lot more. We're trying to encourage a lot more countries to also invest whilst we do the other battle with the global groups and with international groups here in France, AFD, FFR, that's the lending agency for the French government, FFR being the French Rugby Federation, are looking at ways to invest more in Francophone Africa. So money is what it's about, because sport is big business. And I think the more that you invest, then you're going to get what are the best athletes in the world. I think there are 1,200 African players playing rugby in France right now. And more than half of the team are people of color, of either Africa or African descent. So the quality of the players are there, and we see it in the English team as well, and in other teams as well. So investment comes in, you'll get much better quality play across the continent.
Taking it back to Africa itself, I mean, what benefit do you think investing in the game more widely outside of the football pitch can bring to the continent?
Well, the values that you have in rugby are far superior than that in football or anything else. So once we start from grassroots level, which is what we're doing right across the continent, in maybe not a non-physical form of touch rugby, it's about respect, solidarity, teamwork, all the things that you want your children to be brought up with. You don't see a rugby match in which somebody 2 meters high and maybe the weight of Antonio at 150 kilos, looking down at a referee who's wagging his finger at him saying, referee, I don't agree with you, or being rude. That is what rugby is all about. And therefore, it must be the way forward.
One thing that has been flagged is that those, particularly on the continent, who can play the game tend to be pretty comfortable. How can you make the game less elitist?
Well, I think that is true and false in many ways. Here in Europe, it's played really amongst those who can, as opposed to for everybody. Everybody plays football. And in private schools, you play rugby. In Africa, it's actually the poor who play rugby rather than the rich who play rugby. It's not so much a color thing, because Africa, we are white, black, Arabic, right across in different forms. Kenya, who have been playing until this year on HSBC Sevens, one of the best in the world, are all people of color, very black actually. And then you have the breakdown in different ways depending on the colonial history and the colonial past.
Thank you so much for giving us a talk through about rugby, your passion clearly, and its potential for the continent. We will be following the Springbok very closely this weekend, no doubt. Thank you so much, Mr. Mensah, for coming in to speak to us. Well, before we leave, our final story, the French helicopter carrier Mistral is on a 4-month mission in the Gulf of Guinea to combat piracy and trafficking. It's working closely with African partners like Nigeria, and this even as its presence triggers tensions with other countries in the region like Niger. Laurent Berstecker talks us through.
Landing on the Lagos beach, French and Nigerian soldiers simulate a hostage rescue operation. A military exercise that's become common in the Gulf of Guinea, one of the most dangerous maritime zones in the world.
Since 2020, there's been a peak of insecurity in the Gulf of Guinea, with increasingly frequent attacks, kidnappings, and widespread piracy.
Since the early 90s, France has maintained a constant military presence in the Gulf of Guinea. In August, it deployed the Mistral, the country's second-largest warship, to patrol the West African coast. Its main objective, protecting French interests in the region by fighting piracy and narco-trafficking. In this context, the French Navy frequently collaborates with countries like Nigeria, Senegal, or Angola, which are often better equipped to deal with these specific threats.
I think the Nigerian Navy can really help us deal with piracy and maritime criminal activity. They have much more experience with this kind of trafficking and special ships engineered for these specific missions.
Yet France's presence in the Gulf of Guinea is also a source of tensions. In September, Niger's military government accused Paris of deploying its troops in the region ahead of an armed intervention. France has denied the accusations, but said the Mistral warship could yet play a role to help evacuate French troops from Niger.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks so much for joining us. Please do again if you can. Till then, take care.